Just to kind of lay it out, we're going to spend about the first 15 or 20 minutes talking about 1031, the rules and the regulations and why it exists and how long it exists and those types of things. We're going to spend about the last 10 minutes of that time talking about imaginative ways to use 1031s and reverse exchanges, forward reverse exchanges, backward reverse exchanges. And then we'll spend the last 15 minutes in any Q&A you might have. And we'll, hopefully educate you and interest you and make you aware of the opportunities that exist in this particular situation. So let me attempt to manipulate the technology here and get everybody on board. The purpose of a 1031 is to allow you to sell a piece of trade, business, or investment property and purchase a piece of trade, business, or investment property and defer the capital gains. And that capital gains comes in two different forms. Basically, it comes in the federal form. That's a sliding rate between 15 and 20%. If you sell a reasonable piece of property, it's almost always going to be 20%. And then in a number of states, it also comes in the form of a state capital gains tax, ranging from a 4.55 here in Colorado as an example to a 13.3% rate in California. California is by far the highest, and we're going to talk a little bit more about California. But the real purpose from your point of view is that it allows you to keep doing transactions and not pay your non-responsive partner, i.e. the state or federal government, or both, a tax each and every time you do it. Okay? Any taxpayer can do a 1031. And by taxpayer, that's any individual or organization that has a tax ID number files a federal income tax return. We're going to speak basically in terms of the federal law. On occasions when necessary, I'll touch on the state, but I'll let you know that the difference is. All right. So the exchanger gives up or sells one or more of the qualifying real estate interests. And this is important. It doesn't say real estate, it says a real estate interest. So just so that you all know, real estate interests vary from state to state. In the West and most of the oil producing country, oil rights are real estate. In Colorado, water rights are real estate. We have sold air rights. We have developmental rights, conservation easements. So that's really important that it's a real estate interest. And in addition to that, such things as Delaware statutory trusts, tenants in common, these are all real estate interests that can be exchanged within the provisions of this tax return. We're going to talk about the rules, and I'm going to explain to you why the rules become so important. But when you sell a piece of property, that closing entity, title company, real estate attorney, whoever it might be, is going to inform the Internal Revenue Service that you just made X number of dollars. When you complete your 1031, your tax preparer is going to file along with your return what's called an 8824. And that big computer out in the middle of the Utah desert someplace has to align those two. And so that's why the exchanger that sells must be the exchanger that buys. And that's a social security or tax ID number that sells must be the same as the tax ID number that buys. All right, what I'm going to do is kind of walk you quickly through two investors and show you why this is such an important tool for you to have in your toolbox. May not work every time, but it is definitely, at least from my own personal experience of doing these, did my first one in 1977 and as part of my practice of law. I've done somewhere in excess of 30,000 professionally, and I've done 9 personally. So, I know of what I speak from both sides of it. We're going to talk about two investors: A, who does the exchange; B, who does not. And just to give you some variations, they're both going to start off with a $100,000 piece of property that they're going to sell. And investor A is going to do the 1031. investor B is going to pay his $20,000, 20%, and I'm only dealing with federal taxes here, going to pay his 20%. Okay, so going forward, investor A has $100,000, which he can, put his 20% down and borrow against. Investor B has 80. 5 years later, same scenario. They both sell. The property's values have increased. They look at that. At the end of the day, you can see that the taxpayer B is going to pay another $22,000. And when they come to buying new property, taxpayer A is going to have almost a $700,000 capability for roughly $450,000 for taxpayer B. Now it starts to really grow. After 10 years, you can see they sell another property. Again, B pays his tax, $24,000, and he now has approximately $488,000, whereas A has essentially twice as much, $954,000. And then look at the end of 20 years. A now has 4 times what new property purchasing capability that B does. Over the period of time, B's paid $106,000 in tax. A has paid none. But the major thing is, look at what the capabilities are under a new property purchase. You're talking about buying one $800,000 property or 4 $800,000 properties. So just put that in there to show you, roughly give you an idea of the multiplier effect of keeping that $106,000 at work over that 20-year span. All right, here are the key requirements and the legal requirements for 1031. Rule number 1, the property must be held for trade, business, or investment. And essentially that means any place you don't put your little head down every night. It can be raw land. Why? I held it for appreciation. It can be a service station you leased out to your brother-in-law. Okay, it can be a service station your own business leased from you. It can be farm and ranch property. It can be just about anything that was not held as your primary residence. And we'll get into a little bit later, but it can also be certain vacation type properties. From the day you close, all these dates relate from the day of closing on a property, and closing is defined as the day that risk of loss passes. You have 45 days within which to identify properties you wish to purchase. The identification rules are pretty specific, but basically you can identify up to 3 properties. The only requirement is that they must be in the United States, American Virgin Islands, or Guam. We actually did one in Guam about a year ago. Took us a long time to get to Guam, but we got there eventually. So, and they can be of any value. And when they talk about like-kind property, they're still talking about a real estate asset. So you can sell a single-family residence and buy 10 acres for future development. Okay, you can sell a small apartment building and buy a large industrial that you're going to lease out to a bolt and nut manufacturing company. That 45 days is rock solid, and the only time there is ever a modification of that is when you get a Irma or an Ivan, or Ira, I guess was the last one. It requires a presidentially declared disaster in order to modify that 45-day period. Number 3, from the day you close, you have 180 days within which you have to purchase new property. And that means you have to have a closing, you have to have risk of loss passing on your new property. So the government's going to give you a benefit, but they're going to make you follow some certain rules and make you stay within some certain guidelines in order to do that. Rule number 4, you must use a qualified intermediary. The purpose of that is twofold. And we're going to talk about what a qualified intermediary does in a minute, but the basic idea is that the government does not want to allow the individual taxpayer to control all of the aspects of the transaction, And for that reason, they require that a qualified intermediary be inserted. They do not say who can be a qualified intermediary. They only say who cannot be a qualified intermediary. So you can't use your attorney, you can't use your accountant, you can't use a related party. And that's what's led to our industry, is the the ability to step into these and to direct, to guide, and to document the transactions. Title requirement. This is the one I was talking about a little bit before. The taxpayer that sells must be the taxpayer that buys. And again, the reason for that is that big computer out in the middle of Utah someplace has to make all those numbers line up. If it doesn't, they kick it out and some human eye looks at your tax return. And the one thing you do not want is for human eyes to look at your tax return. Reinvestment requirement. In order to have a 100% deferred exchange, you must invest equal or up, which means that you must invest an amount equal to the cash plus the debt relief you received at closing. Doesn't mean you have to go out and get a new mortgage for exactly the same amount. You can put up additional cash, but it does mean that you cannot take cash out of the transaction. If you do, that becomes taxable. If that's something you wish to talk about, call me first of the week. I'll tell you how to take cash out after the fact. All right. And number 7 isn't one of the statutes, but it's certainly the best tip I can give you, which is act prior to closing. Contact us. I mean, I have literally had closers call me and say, hey, Dan, we're sitting at the closing table and the sellers decided to do a 1031. Okay, send everybody out for lunch. We'll get the documents, we'll get them to you. But in this market, in these changing times, you want to act prior to closing. So let your real estate broker know what you're going to do. Call us. We'll walk you through the key things you want to look for, and then start looking for new properties. New properties, I think, are going to get a little bit easier to find, but there was a time there where it was really, really difficult. All right. What does a QI do? What does a qualified intermediary do? Number 1, we're going to walk you through the subject matter. We're going to walk you through the application. And as I train my people, you have not succeeded if the client is not comfortable. So walk them through it, explain it to them, make sure if they want to be involved, their attorney, their accountant, their real estate agent, everyone is at ease with the processes and procedures that are going to take place. We obtain from the closing agent the 2 things. Number 1, a copy of the real estate contract, and number 2, a copy of the title work. And based on that, we then prepare a series of documents. Real quickly, the documents you're going to see are the exchange agreement, which keeps the IRS happy. 17 pages, anything with a page of legal descriptions is subject to or prepared for the purposes of the federal government. You're going to see a banking agreement that you sign with the banks that we use. And that basically says you have a contract with the bank, that money cannot be moved without your consent, the bank's consent, and our consent. And then we're going to, at the time of closing, all those documents are going to get signed. There's some other ancillary documents, obviously, and assignments and notices and those types of things. And the funds are going to be wired directly from the title company to a bank. We use 3 different banks in 3 different locations because of the size and volume of business that we do. And that bank is going to open an account in your name with your social security number on it and immediately notify you of receipt of those funds. When they notify you of receipt of those funds, that triggers a process in our office. And a couple of days later, the lovely Sherry is going to send you a package that says, thanks for doing business with us. On this date, we received this amount of money. Based on that, here are your important dates, your 45th day, your 180th day. If you disagree with any of these, please notify us immediately. And the 3rd page is the form for you to fill out so that you can return the notification to us as to which properties you're going to purchase. That is a straight exchange, what we call a straight exchange. You sell one, you buy one. You can buy more than one. You can sell one and buy three. You can sell one and buy five under the right circumstances. Okay. And so what I'm going to branch off into now are reverse exchanges. And reverse exchanges basically allow you to purchase or modify a new property either before or after you've sold an old property. Most of the reverse exchanges that we do, and we've done them on everything from ranches to the one you'll all recognize probably is I did the IBM World Headquarters in New York City as a reverse exchange. So but most of them are for the purpose of purchasing a new property before the old property is sold. And I've had clients in the last 18 months I've done half a dozen reverse exchanges for because they were in the apartment buying mode. And when they saw an opportunity, they needed to jump on it. They had significant cash to do that. And they had a bank who was very cooperative. And so this particular client would go out and buy an apartment building and then tell me, I'm going to sell this and this and this. Whichever one sells first, that's what I'm going to do. All right. The second purpose for a reverse exchange is to make improvements. Probably the most graphic one that I can use is actually the Starbucks nearest to my home here in town was at one point in time a Texaco gas station. And on a reverse exchange, we bought that, working with the clients and the state government, obviously, tore the tanks out, essentially gutted the building, completely redid it, and it is now probably, it's a Starbucks. I'm not a real Starbucks fan, but every time I drive by it, the cars are lined up. You know, it's a good thing it was a large service station because they've got a large lineup of cars. But you know, you talk about a reuse or a repurposing, there's certainly a situation. Build new construction using exchange funds. We don't do as many of these as the other types because the governmental permitting process for new construction is so slow, but we have actually built from the ground up. And I'm doing one in Texas right now. That's a rather large apartment complex, but they had their ducks in a row and they were ready to seriously rock and roll. And basically, here's how it works. Because you're not allowed to put 1031 dollars into property you're already entitled to, we have a separate entity that will establish an EAT, exchange accommodation title holder is what the IRS calls it, an EAT. We do all of these in conformity with IRS revenue procedure called 2037 that we got a hand in writing back 20 plus years ago. And so we set up a limited liability company in the state in which the property is located. That limited liability company then borrows from you or from you and your lender the cash necessary to take title and close on that property. In the case of an apartment building or something like that that has an income flow, under normal circumstances, we will lease that property back to the exchanger. You manage it, you collect it, you pay the obligations. Okay. 90 days down the road, you sell your old property. You do what we call a straight 1031 exchange. That $1.5 million comes into our account. You and I then have a conversation, or you and Caleb have a conversation and say, what do you want to do with this? And you're probably going to say, well, I want the $500,000 I put up back. Okay. And use the balance to pay down the bank loan. Fine. So we document all of that and we transfer the EAT back to you. We don't deed the property to you because if we do that, that triggers another real estate closing. And in some states, i.e. Florida, it triggers significant taxes and fees. So for that reason, and in addition to that, that would be a sale, so it may trigger the due on sale clause of the mortgage, right? So the transfer of the interest in the exchange accommodation title holder, the EAT, the IRS says is the equivalent to transferring the underlying property, and it does not trigger a due on sale clause because we haven't sold the property, we've sold the entity that owns the property, and it does not trigger the transfer taxes, et cetera, which can be significant. Just as an aside, we just did a rather large transaction up in Aspen, here in Colorado for one of our clients, and the city transfer taxes on that transaction alone were $995,000. Well, we had to pay that the first time. We had no choice. We didn't have to pay it a second time. And even though that particular client happens to own an NFL team, and so the 995 is not as painful as it would be for you or me, anytime we can avoid that type of situation, we attempt to do it. So that's where the transfer of the EAT avoided the triggering of that fairly significant tax ramification. Improvement exchange, very simple, similar. We simply get new cash from you or from a lender, or exchange proceeds if they're available. We set up an EAT, we park the new property, we enter into a construction management agreement. Work begins, the EAT pays the bill because it's the owner, after they're approved, of course, by the construction manager. Within 180 days, hopefully we have expended all the funds. And at the end of that 180 days, we transfer the ownership of the EAT to you. So we see a lot of these with people who are buying C apartment complexes and want to raise them to B apartment complexes. Those types of scenarios. Just finished one where large industrial, but they needed to make some changes because the new leasee was a different type of industry. And so they needed to make, the big one was we put in a couple $100,000 worth of craneage into the building because of the heavy type of lifting that the new tenant was doing. So we can really design, or you can really design the new property to fit the bill that you need and use the 1031 tax deferred dollars in the process. Reverse construction exchange, same basic course. We just put a different saddle on it and ride it to a different location. The inherent problem with total construction is the governmental permitting. We can do this if the client has, and I had one in San Antonio a while back, where the client had with the seller of the dirt, had reached an agreement and they went through all the planning and zoning processes before there was an actual sale. So the 180 days did not start until there were already building permits and appropriate zoning in place. Okay, and once that takes place, builders can move pretty rapidly and spend money very rapidly. But if you're sitting around waiting for the government to approve a building permit or a zoning change, everybody in the world understands that time is money except the government. The important thing here is that a certificate of occupancy is not required within the 180 days. All we really have to do is get the money spent within that 180 days. And sometimes there's a lot of money spent on day 177, 178. I'll take any questions you might have. If you've got a scenario, lay it out there and we'll run it by and attempt to, to solve any problems or address any issues you might see. Here's our information. Feel free to contact us. John, you had a question?
Hello, Dan. Yes, sir, I do. Thank you so much for the information. I really appreciate it. I wonder if the EAT is anything similar to the boot, and if not, if you have time to tell us anything about the boot.
You bet. And just for those of you who didn't hear or are confused by John's language, we're using inside football language here. Boot, B-O-O-T, is any money you take out of the transaction that is taxable. It originally was thought to have been booty from the old pirate idea. And that's what boot is. Boot is any cash you take out of the transaction that becomes taxable. All right. So let's assume for the sake of argument that John sells a property for $900,000. And he's $800,000 in equity and $100,000 loan. Okay. And he has an immediate need for $50,000. He can tell the title company and tell us, I'm going to put $800,000 into the exchange, or $850,000, the cash plus the debt, but I want to take $50,000 out. And that's boot. And that is taxable. And you can absolutely do that. You have to do it before the exchange starts. You cannot take any cash out once the exchange is in process. You can't call me up and say, hey, Dan, I just fell in love with a new, I just found a 78 Corvette and I fell in love with it. I need $50,000. I have to say, sorry, John, I can't help you. I appreciate your taste in automobiles, but I cannot help you. So that's boot. The EAT is the exchange accommodation title holder that is used during a reverse exchange, no matter what type, straight reverse, I mean, a normal reverse or construction, an improvement, that type of thing. That's the EAT. The EAT is the exchange accommodation title holder. That's almost always an LLC. It is the legal entity that owns the property until John's ready to take it. And that's the difference between those two words.
Awesome. Thank you.
No problem. Understood that I apologize if I use a little more of the lingo, because quite often, in the interest of time, we do that. And we start to talk about straight exchanges and reverse exchanges and EATs and boot and 45 days. That's what I mean when I say one of the things I do when we bring new people aboard is make them very, very cognizant that if you don't have a complete grasp of the transaction, they're not doing their job. Do we have any other questions? Come on, this is your opportunity,
Dan, this is
have
Patrick.
Not because you asked not.
Dan, this is Patrick. We were in the breakout room together. First of all, thank you for the presentation.
Hope you got
great presentation. You bet. We're in snow country to snow country. Phenomenal strategy, great presentation, and a great service you guys provide. Could you comment briefly, Dan, on the use of a DST, Delaware Statutory Trust, in a 1031?
Not at all. Here we're gonna use some more language here, gang. So bear with me because I'm going to define them first. A DST is called a Delaware Statutory Trust. It is a legal entity that can own real estate and that you can invest in, but the IRS still considers you to be a fractional owner of that real estate. The other similar, its cousin, for lack of a better word, is a TIC, tenant in common. And let me just give you a little background. Back in the early 2000s, the TIC industry took off. And the TIC industry would be John and Tammy and Jeffrey and Ken and I getting together and buying a building. And I would own 10% and John would own 30 and Tammy would own 20 and people would own different pieces. That was very, very common, very, very popular. I happened to be involved in one with some friends, and we've owned a 44-unit building for close to 15 years. About time to sell it. We're just about had it sold, but it didn't go through. So you can do that. You can get together with a group of friends and do that. What happened was syndicators were then taking that. They would come up with a building. They would go out to the general public and attempt to sell interests in that building. And the people who were investing had no commonality other than the fact that they had an interest in this building. And that worked really well. up until about 08. And what happened in 08 was, and these were realtors, basically real estate people who were doing this. They were not stockbrokers. They were finance people and real estate people. Well, in 08, some of the investors all of a sudden realized that, you know what, the real estate market goes up and the real estate market goes down, and I don't like the going down. So they turned around and sued the people, the syndicators who had put these deals together, and said, you didn't sell me real estate, you really sold me a security. And the SEC got involved. To be blunt about it, the government changed the rules in the middle of the game. And there were some really good people that paid a terrible price because they thought they were doing, you know, what could be done. And at the time they did it, what was legal. But then the Securities and Exchange Commission came in and said, no, we're going to rule that those are no longer real estate interests. They're now a security. And if you were not a licensed stockbroker, you could not sell them. So what arose out of the ashes of that was the Delaware Statutory Trust. And the Delaware Statutory Trust is a vehicle, again, offered by syndicators. There are a couple of very, very large ones. Inland is probably the largest in the US. They probably got 25 to 27% of the market. And what they will do is they'll go out and find a huge project, buy it, and offer it back to investors. And because of the way, and they can only be sold through registered stockbrokers, through licensed brokers. So not real estate brokers, stockbrokers, because they're considered a security for sale purposes, but a real estate interest for taxation purposes. And so where we get involved with it, and I just finished, I don't know, half a dozen of them, I guess, in the last 2 months, is where they will wind down. And in TIC, each individual owner can either stay with the sponsor and go into another project, or they can do their own individual 1031 and go off and do something else. Find another TIC they like, go buy a condo in Maui, whatever it is. And so the important thing to remember about TICs is they're treated as securities for sale purposes, but they're treated as real estate for taxation purposes. And so they ended up kind of being the hybrid. I guess the downside of that is now the people that are pushing these are, for the most part, not pure real estate people. They're really stockbrokers that's another tool in the stockbroker's toolbox. But that's what a Delaware Statutory Trust is. And the name comes from the fact that they all have to be established in Delaware because Delaware is the only state that has this particular setup. So that's a DST. Did I answer your question? I mean, I was lengthy, but did you get the answer you were looking for?
Yes, thanks, Dan.
Not a problem. And we see a lot of people doing that because they are, I used to call them mailbox money, but they're really laptop money, because all you have to do is go in and see whether or not the deposit got made this month or this quarter into your account. You're the owner of the property. The syndicator manages it. The syndicator decides when to sell it. There is no secondary market. You can't get out of it once you're in it. I mean, you could theoretically if you could convince your best friend to buy it from you, but it's very difficult. They usually last on average about 7 to 8 years. And then the sponsor will sell it. They get a fee when they sell it, obviously. And then you get your gain on the property. And, and it's a very viable investment tool, something I would, if you don't want to if you're tired of tenants and toilets, it's a way to stay in real estate. The returns are less, but the risk is less also. And the work is de minimis. So they definitely have a place. But I don't sell them. So, but they do definitely have a place. Well, Tammy, I I don't hear any other questions, so
All right,
got something else?
yeah. Sure. Just one last thing. Does anybody have a question for Dan before he jumps off? Thank you again so much, Dan, for all of the information. That was really thorough and very understandable. So thank you very much for all of
Yeah,
that. I know the subject matter gets to be like in the weeds sometimes, so you made it very
yeah.
easy to follow.
Well, let me just say, if you want some more information, shoot me or Caleb an email. We'll be glad to respond. We'll send you a little brochure. You can read through it. I know for myself, sometimes it's easier to do this when you're a little more relaxed. You can do it at your own pace, and then pick up the phone, give us a call. We're available. We're gonna answer your call, and as you can see, at the bottom of my number there is my cell phone, because all these opportunities do not arrive from 8 to 5 Monday through Friday. So pick up the phone, give us a call, and we're going to make sure that you get the information you need to make the most advantageous move you can. One last line from a friend, not a friend, but a very smart man by the name of Learned Hand, who was a New York State Court of Appeals judge. No one is required to pay more than necessary. It's not even a patriotic duty. Put that in Dan McCabe-ism. It isn't what you make, it's what you get to keep that counts.
That's right.
So keep that in mind. You all have a good day. And if there are any of the Tampa Bay fans, I would just remind you that you're being spoken to from the Stanley Cup capital of the world. Have a great day.